This was shown the town where I was born, which is Bratislava, and my parents were both born in the Austria-Hungarian Empire. I was born in Czechoslovakia, and that photograph will have been taken when it was Slovakia already, because the Czechs and the Slovaks eventually again divided up again to become separate states. And this is the river Danube, and as you can see, there is a sort of ruin at the top of the hill, and if you can also see the wall running down the hill. It's a fortified castle, but if we go to the next picture, you will see we've got a different scene now. We're down further in the town, and on the far right-hand side as you face it is the synagogue where my family used to go, and on the left-hand side is the Catholic Cathedral of Bratislava. And I'll let you into a secret. We've got a ring road just above that, and they haven't got proper foundations, and they've got problems because this it might collapse unless they do something with it, so they didn't do their planning right. Now, the synagogue is no longer there, but it wasn't destroyed like the synagogues were in Austria and in Germany, because of course we weren't invaded till 1939. But if you look at the next picture, and I'm not sure whether I've got the next one on, anyway, the synagogue has gone, and we're now further in the town, and I just want to show you the castle, which you've seen before. It's now got a lovely red roof on, and if any of you ever visit Bratislava, that is now a museum. It's a museum which is only of interest, I think, for people who do military stuff. Otherwise, it's much better to walk around the grounds and look at them. Now, there are two reasons for this photograph. First of all, you will see some modern buildings underneath the castle, and we live actually in the building which is just to the right of it. And you see some lovely modern buildings here. There were all small cottages where the shadow is, and they built these houses. But if we go to the next photograph, if it's the same stick we've got, you'll see the corner of the building. This is now a big first-class hotel, which stands on the plot where my grandfather's and grandmother's house stood. So if you go to that one, you'll see that, and that is what it looked like. The whole district has been destroyed to make it more modern, and it's also got a sort of circular route around the town through there. But these were my mother's parents, and the ground floor was their shop, which was a big ironmonger's, and then they had on the corner of two streets. One street went down, which was called Vysoká ulica, which means High Street, and the other one went down this way. And they had a large magazine with all their materials underneath. My grandparents lived on the first floor. My uncle, their son, lived on the second floor, and on the top floor they had two other flats which they used to let out. But that building, of course, does not exist. It has been destroyed. Now, if we go to the next picture, you will see now I'm going to introduce you to my family. And this is my father. He's got a very propitious name. He was called Adolf. So it's Adolf Feldman, and he was already in his 50s. And there's my mother, Alžbeta. And the tragedy of it is that my father, being already 56, felt he couldn't come to England as a housekeeper or as a labourer, and he thought that the Nazi era would pass and things would be much better. But unfortunately, he was one of the many people who was murdered in Auschwitz, and my mother is one of the 2 million women, or 2 million people, I should say, who have never been found. I've got a long story to tell about her, but there won't be time about that today. So let's go to the next one, please. here you'll see a lovely group of 3 children. Here am I sitting in the pram in 1929, my elder brother and my sister. You can see how beautifully we were dressed. We were probably out with our nanny, walking by the side of the Danube, because this is on the promenade, and there was a lovely walk, and there still is a nice walk by the Danube, should you happen to go to Bratislava. Now, I'm not going to tell you the story of my brother and sister in detail, because there isn't the time, but my brother was the eldest. He was 7 years older than I was, and he eventually was the last one of the 3 of us children to come to England. But he was already 18, and therefore he couldn't come under a children's sort of protection transport. He had to come to a job. And he came to be apprenticed to a farrier's in London. Now, most people don't know what farriers are these days. They no longer wear fur coats, but they weren't making fur coats. They were actually making leather helmets for pilots and leather gloves and leather jackets, because the fighter pilots had no heating in their cabins. They had to be warm for flying up high. So he started off by doing that. He eventually studied at night school and married, had a family, and he became a highfalutin professor of mathematics and metallurgy and God knows what. He spoke 7 languages, but that's enough of him. But he was instructed when he left home by my father that he had to look after me, because I was the youngest and I needed support probably if father didn't survive. And he actually did that all his life long, although he's been dead now for about 10 years. Now my sister, she went to, the first one of us to leave home. She arrived in England on the 1st of January 1939, and she went to a Jewish family in London, where she stayed with them. She had a wonderful education, and she became a medical consultant, and she has a family. So that's my siblings. Now if you come to me, we can go to the next one, please. And I'm just showing you something about our lives. First of all, I must tell you that unfortunately my father lost his livelihood the year I was born, when I was about 6 months old. Because in 1929, there was the terrible catastrophe which is known as the Wall Street crash, when people lost their livelihoods. All the bankers went kaput, not only in America, but all over Europe. And my father's bank, he was a banker, was only established after the end of the First World War. It was a small bank. It couldn't sustain this particular situation, and he therefore lost his job. And he never had a proper job after that, because he just earned his living by being a journalist, which was rather an occasional job, and he helped out a friend as an estate agent. But my mother's side of the family, and she had the 3 sisters and a brother, and of course her parents were still alive, were wealthy, and they were all very generous. And this is a holiday snap. We're actually in Austria, in Waldstein, and I think it's a lovely photograph. It gives you an idea how a well-dressed elderly gentleman should look. Just look at my grandfather, well-fed, fantastic moustache, and there's Grandma. She actually runs the business. She was the brain behind the business. I'm squashed between her and my mum. There's my brother looking rather scowling, and my sister, and my father. And it was the fashion in those days to walk with a walking stick. And we're in Bad Gastein in Austria. We can go to the next one, please. This will show you another holiday snap. A happy family. We're in Yugoslavia this time, and we're by the seaside. And again, you can see my mother was quite fashionable. And my brother there has got me round, standing with me. Okay, well, those are the holiday snaps. So what happened? What else? While I was growing up, I was very fortunate. I had ballet lessons, and during the winter we used to go tobogganing and skating. And we had a very nice life, and I never realized that my father was impecunious. To me, it was just fantastic. And now we have moved on a little bit, and this is my father's family. And this is a sad photograph, actually, because this was taken after the funeral of my father's father, in fact my paternal grandfather. And father was the eldest of 9 siblings. And father has got my brother on his knee, my mother to the right of him, and my grandma. And my brothers, my sister sitting down at the bottom, and some cousins, and I've got the sailor collar on them. And I'm not going to go through all the family, but unfortunately, the majority of them either were incarcerated or were killed. Very, very few of them survived throughout the war. But it was very sad, but it's the only photograph I have. And the siblings of my brother, of my father rather, I will go through a little later, but that gives you a family idea. And we're in a small village in Slovakia, a village called Vrbove, and I don't think it's much more than a little village now. The next one, please. Now, these are the siblings of my father. His mother was hidden, and she survived all her children, and she lived to be a lady well into her 90s, and she died in the late 1950s. My father went to Auschwitz, as I've already mentioned. So did his sister next to him, who came from Vienna, because of course with the Austro-Hungarian Empire not so long distant. And then the other side of Grandma, we have another lady who lived in the same village as my grandma, another sister. She was a farmer, and she was killed in Auschwitz. Sitting next to her is Uncle Frigyes. He lived in Budapest. He survived because, of course, the Hungarians were not invaded till 1944. And his wife survived, and he had 2 children. One survived in Theresienstadt, and his son died on a death march, so he's already looked after. Now, behind him is my auntie, also from Vienna, but she's the only one whose entire family was saved, because her younger sister, who is the tall lady in the middle, my Aunt Aurelia, lived in New York, and she had married an American in 1929, and she managed to get that aunt's family out, and she was trying desperately to get more people out, but unfortunately it was impossible. By the time war had started, she couldn't do it. But standing to her left is my Uncle Karl, who was a bachelor, and he died in Auschwitz about 2 weeks after my father. Now, if we come to the lady at the far end, that's Auntie Shari, and she lived in Budapest, and her daughter had the most unfortunate situation of being on one of these committees within the camps who had to choose the people who would be sent to Auschwitz to be killed. And she never lived it all her life. She had this terrible, horrible situation of having had to select her mother to go on to one of these terrible things from which she never came back. And they live in Hungary. But my uncle with the moustache, he was a doctor, and his wife and daughter were killed also in Auschwitz. But he's the unusual one, because he actually goes to Russia, and he ends up with the Czechoslovak army contingent within the Russian army as one of their doctors. and he comes in with the Russian Liberating Army into Czechoslovakia. So there you've got a complete story of my grandmother's siblings and my father being the eldest of hers. And you can imagine an elderly lady who has lost all her family. She must have had a most horrendous life after that. But she was religious, and she spent her last few years, I think, reading the religious prayers and things. But she was extremely short-sighted, and I'm supposed to be like her. So we can have the next one now. I could go on, but please stop me when you've had enough. Very quickly, this was my school. I went to a Jewish school, but now that building is no longer a Jewish school. It has, in fact, the Slovak insignia. It is an office part of the Slovak government. So that's it. Next one, please. Now, this is my form. Most of you are used to classes of 30 or thereabouts for primary schools. We had between 50 and 60. And if I had to choose 2 pictures from this would be one of them. And the reason is this. Statistically, only 10% of Jewish children survived in Slovakia. There are actually 55 kids there if you have time to count them, but pretend there are 50. That means only 5 of them survived. We've got me picked out. There is one other lad who's just standing, a rather large lad standing behind this foremost that I know who was alive. But statistically, only 5 of those children survived. My best friend is on the front row with her eyes closed. She was a baker's daughter, but I've never ever heard of her since I left home, so I have to assume she too would have been killed. And if you look at the back of the picture, you can just see there's a street there, and that's significant because that is the Židovská ulica, which means Jews' street, and the really Orthodox Jews have their little dwellings up there, and there were 2 or 3 different synagogues. But on the day that I always thought the Germans came into Czechoslovakia, and I made a mistake. It wasn't the Germans. It was the Czechoslovak army had tanks on the street there. And our schoolmaster told us, it was only about 10 in the morning, we'd scarcely got to school, and he said, go and get your coats and go home as quickly and as quietly as you can. And when we got into the street, we realized there were tanks out there. But it was the Czech army, and the reason for it was the Czechs wanted to side with the West against Hitler. And the Slovaks, a stronger Catholic country, also felt they had to identify with Hitler. They wanted to go with him. And the Czechoslovaks didn't want that, so the tanks came up there, but it didn't help because 2 days later the Germans did actually take sort of control of Slovakia. So please, the next one. Now, this is a very peculiar picture, but I rather like it. And the reason is that the Germans went into Austria in March 1938, and I think many of you may remember we had Mr. Chamberlain in September 1939 going to meet Hitler, because Hitler had already taken part of Czechoslovakia, and Chamberlain was trying to make an arrangement with him that there would be no more marching and taking over places and so on. And they agreed on this. Mr. Chamberlain came home very pleased. Unfortunately, Hitler didn't keep his words because 6 months later he was in Czechoslovakia. But this is where my grandmother had her farm in Vrbove. My father sent us to the country. And you can see it's quite cold, and the little fellow who's laughing is actually the son of a cousin, and I don't know who made the joke, But we all swapped each other's hats, and we were having a great time. We didn't stay there long. We went back to Bratislava, and then, of course, the Germans came into Bratislava and took control, so to speak, in March 39. Now, let's have the next one, please. That's my passport photograph. It's a bit grainy because it's not my photograph. I thought I had to sort of take it off the passport. And this was necessary because I was traveling to England. And I was traveling with an aunt, my mother's youngest sister, and my cousin who was 5. My aunt was coming to service in Knightsbridge, and I was going to a family in Newcastle. And if you go to the next one, I'll tell you a little bit more about that, because we now have a life in England. But what is quite interesting, that I came over as a refugee, and I travelled with this aunt and cousin, and before I talk to that particular slide, I will tell you we travelled by train, and normally it would have taken just a day, a little bit over a day, to get from Bratislava to London. Unfortunately, we had to travel through Germany and Austria, which was occupied, and of course we were occupied. And the Germans weren't very pleasant. They used to come onto the trains and they used to turf out refugees and people who were trying to flee. And every time we were turfed on the train, we turned up on another train, there were fewer and fewer people. And eventually we end up in Munich, and my aunt has 2 children, 7 pieces of luggage, and we are stuck in a waiting room all night long in the pitch dark, not knowing whether we'll ever get anywhere. But anyway, we were fortunate. Next morning, we did manage to get on the train, which got us to Holland, where we were met by, I presume, social workers or something. We were given food, we were welcomed. We were put onto a proper train, and we then went off to Harwich, where we crossed to London. And when we crossed to London, we spent 4 nights in a boarding house. But amongst other things, I was given a thing like this in 3 languages, telling me I had to behave myself, and I had to be a good behavior. And quite honestly, I can't remember saying goodbye to my parents. I think it's one of those deep memories which I tried to hide, because the pain of leaving home must have been too great. All I remember was being put in a taxi with my aunt, and we got on the train. And when I arrived in London, somehow or other by magic, I ended up in Newcastle, but I was given this sort of thing. I have to behave myself. Unfortunately, I was very sad. I'm unhappy in Newcastle. That is very important. That says that I'm to leave the UK by the 30th of June in 1940. Well, I'll cut a very long story short. As you see, I'm still here. I ended up in Yorkshire. I came here to university. I found a young man. I got a family. And I'm glad to be here to be able to tell you the story. But we don't need to go through it anymore, because those are just my school or my various other things. But that is a nice photograph. Oh, that's also, oh, there you are. They want to show you my husband and my 2 children. They're coming in the next one if you're going to show it. Now, Ruth the elder is 66, 68, 69, sorry. And the other one's 2 years younger. So you can see I've been very lucky, and I wouldn't really like to talk to Torn from Home. I really wanted to talk about the tremendous help, the friendship and kindness of strangers. And I mean, I could go on talking for hours. I live on my own and I can chat for hours. And that is a concentration camp in Slovakia, which has now been changed into a museum. And my mother is one of the 6 people whose stories they've done in detail, but I could go on and on. But I will have it talk for anybody this time. Oh, so that is part of what was the concentration camp. And that, unfortunately, for those of you who are not squeamish, is where they bury all the people they shot. So we don't always show that picture. That is in Sered. So, what else can I tell you? We're a Holocaust, and one thing we haven't learned, and that's to learn to live with each other in peace. And my final message would be, doesn't matter what your color, what your creed, what your race, just think yourself as a human being should be decent to everybody else. And that's it. Thank you.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.